All right, what do you think, Leah? Should we get going? All right. Welcome everyone to, I believe it's the final panel of the EURUS Graduate Student Research Conference. It's been going on for a couple of days here, and by all accounts has been going really well. I managed to drop into a few panels myself and have been really impressed with the level of graduate student research and presentation going on from EURUS students and those calling in from all sorts of different places, which is a kind of neat benefit of the virtual world, although I know we'd all just as soon be gathered in person and go for a drink afterwards kind of thing. I'm Erica Fraser. I'm in the Department of History at Carleton in Russian and Soviet history, and this is, I believe, our history panel, or at least one of, although history has been touched on in previous panels. This is Imperial Legacies and Soviet Histories. I'll ask, I think everyone knows the drill, but folks in the audience to mute yourselves for while the presenters are presenting, of course, if you can remember to keep your mutes on. We'll take questions at the end. We should have lots of time for questions. We'll have our four presenters go in order. I'll give a few comments, but my goal is to leave plenty of time for you folks to ask questions of our presenters and discuss some of the research yourselves as well. Our presenters, I'll ask to each take 15 minutes and stick to that fairly strictly, and we'll start. It's not quite the same as in person where we poke you with a pen or something. We'll just sort of start waving if you're going over time, but I think you're all aware of that. So our first presenter today is coming from the US, from my old haunting grounds. Alex Craver is a PhD candidate at Northern Illinois University. And he'll be presenting today on a paper called Nothing They Say Survived the Dandelions, Soviet Science, Stalinist Agriculture, and the Global Political Economy of Rubber. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you everyone here at the conference for making this happen. It's my pleasure to present here. So what am I going to present? This talk sort of represents a go-between point between my prospectus for my PhD and my dissertation, and like moving towards chapter 1. Okay, there we go. False alarm. This is just a quick background. Anyone who knows it, we can chime in the Q&A. Bonus points for you. I'll give you a hint. It was used in the movie Downfall to represent wartime Berlin. It is not that place. But we can talk about that later. As we said, I got the byline of talking about Soviet science, Stalinist agriculture, and political economy. So we're going to run through all that. I'm going to give you guys an overview of that, a little bit of literature review. But my real goal is to try and get through that so we can talk about some of the cases that I'm finding in my research right now, because I find them very interesting and I'm curious what people think about that. So first up, there's the age-old question of why rubber? We can leave that for the Q&A. Generally, I'll say that historians of imperialism, historians of industrialization, historians of technology use it to talk about exploitation. You can talk about biopiracy, the establishment of plantations across the world from the Amazon, development of science, all these other types of stories. If you want something evocative to think about for the rest of this presentation, you have this idea of rubber being one of the essential things for modern human life, right? You could have air, you could have water, you could have oil. Then number 4 is probably going to be rubber. This sort of question comes down to who had colonies, who developed these colonies, who had access to this material as a sort of really, really strategically important material. Mostly this was France, this was England, this was Belgium. So the question becomes, what did countries that didn't have access to rubber do? Especially in the 1920s and 30s, as world trade began to really fall apart. England tried to manipulate rubber prices to make more money. And so countries like the United States, Germany, and the Soviet Union, who were completely dependent on importing rubber, started trying to figure out alternatives to this using technology. One of the fun things that comes out of this is like a discipline called chemurgy, which is a sort of collision between material science and agronomy. The most interesting thing here could be, as you see on the right, the soybean car. It was developed by Henry Ford. It was made out of soybean plastic. Here's him doing an Elon Musk to it, trying to take an axe to it to show up how strong it is. And the car itself was also designed to run on sustainably produced hemp biofuel in 1939. Obviously, the war made that totally pointless, but it's interesting to see the types of strange extremes that came from the economic situation there. For the Soviet Union, it was just the same. They had this desire of developing synthetic rubber. They weren't the first. The German company Continental did it during World War I. Basically, you took a chemical called acetylene, which is from coal, you boil it for 9 months, and boom, you have synthetic rubber. It didn't work very well if you had a car with those types of tires. You would have to lift the car off the ground, or else you get flat spots from the rubber. But basically, there were Soviet chemists at the same time, Sergei Lebedev here, and then another guy named Igor Ostromaslinsky, who figured out how to make it out of alcohol, because they're Russian. No, they were just experts in this type of field, and they actually moved forward and were able to produce it at an industrial level. Ostromaslinsky, interestingly, one of the themes of this is transfers between countries and movement of scientists. He ends up going to America. He goes to Akron. He works for B.F. Goodrich in the 1920s. Lebedev, on the other hand, founds the first synthetic rubber factory in Yaroslavl. He wanted to do one, but then the Soviets said, no, you're making 3. So that's sort of the story on that. They more or less produce it using it's the Lebedev process, but as you can see, you go from spirit on the top to divinol, and then that becomes caoutchouc. Caoutchouc means tears of the tree. It's an early word that means rubber. We know it more often as rezina in Russian today. This wasn't the only thing they produced. Basically, in the 1930s, a botanist named Nikolai Vavilov discovered, he was out in Almaty, and he saw a Kazakh chewing gum. An indigenous folk remedy for chewing gum was taking this species of dandelion called tausagis or koksagis, and you just chew it, right? It's the defensive process of the plant. It excretes latex, and it becomes like an eraser in your mouth. He realized you could make tires out of it. So he discovered that in the 30s. It was also known as Gornaya Zvachka. That's why we have this book by Olga Berkholz, talking about the same type of period. He discovers it, brings it back. They start growing it in collective farms to try and produce their own rubber tires. They're really pretty high quality. One of the things that happens, and Vavilov is famously associated with his confrontation with Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko actually uses his experiments with this dandelion, to support his case and gain favor with Stalin. If you're not familiar with it, Lysenko basically didn't agree with genetics. He just wanted he believed basically you could adapt plants to any environment. And koksagis, because it could grow anywhere, is a really tough little weed. You could grow it in deserts, you could grow it in Siberia. Lysenko used it to support his findings, along with a lot of other experiments, and gained favor. Vavilov, who was a student of William Bateson, more or less refused to disagree that genetics wasn't real and was sent to prison and died. One of the things that happened with this dandelion, though, is more or less as World War II started, all the access to plantations and plantation rubber across the world went away. So a lot of different countries suddenly were scrambling to find domestic alternatives. In the United States, koksagis was more or less freely given by the Soviets to American scientists. It was grown at Cornell, a couple other experimental plants, and was more or less one of many different alternatives that were being experimented with. Like Thomas Edison's another guy who was experimenting with this. He looked at a vine called Cryptostegia, but his number one choice was a flower called goldenrod that he collaborated with Soviet scientists to grow. This didn't work as well as this dandelion. There was a guy earlier I mentioned named Paul Kolochev. He was a Russian immigrant. He became a whiskey brewer at Seagram's Whiskey in Louisville. He was an adamant proponent of growing this rubber in the 40s when basically the entire country was trying to find a source of it because the Japanese had blocked off all access. So that's the American side. There's also a very interesting German side to this story as well. More or less, Vavilov, he collected seeds of this stuff. He had it stored in facilities in Ukraine and Crimea. German scientists knew about this. And when Operation Barbarossa happened and the Nazis attacked Ukraine and Russia, there was an SS officer ordered by Heinrich Himmler to go find this stuff. He was a botanist. He was trained at this place called the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And he told his old teachers, hey, follow our soldiers. We're going to capture some seeds. So this is an SS commando unit that was actually sent to get their hands on basically dandelion seeds to grow natural rubber. They were grown at Auschwitz, at a subcamp of the larger facility, using captured seeds, captured scientists, and prison labor from the area. When the war ended and the United States showed up, they asked the guy in charge of that facility to keep doing it. Very much reminiscent of, Wernher von Braun and, the story of Nazis working in the American space program or other types of Operation Paperclip type deals. He refused. Germany was in a famine and he was going to use his skills to grow potatoes and help his country instead. But these sort of transfers are exactly what I'm interested in and looking at. This sort of represents this larger question about what you could call the devil's milk. It's a historian named John Tully who talks about that. He says that rubber is so important. Laborers always get the short end of the stick. Governments and industry and capital always collude to sort of guarantee this. When you think about modernity in this sense too, of like trying to guarantee comfort, material security to your citizenry, like it all adds up to that story. So, in this line, the Soviets had their own sustainable way of doing it. They managed to provide all these things to their people. Everyone lives happily ever after, right? This is where I'm bringing in my sort of doubts on this question, because there is this question of the devil's milk. Like, is this a little too, are we seeing the other side of this? Are we seeing the exploitation? There's two angles that I want to talk about here. One is the prevalence in my sources of female workers. They're not only sort of the low-level workers in a place like the Red Triangle factory, which predates the Soviet Union. It was founded, it's like the largest rubber factory in Russia, for example. It employed about 10,000 workers. Most of them were women. Their life expectancy was about the age of 40, and they were paid much less than the men. This is partially because they were doing unskilled labor, gluing the soles, rubber soles to galoshes and so on, but it's still there, and I feel like there's a suspicion of this. They also occupied leadership roles. Here's in the Red Bogatyr factory in Moscow. All the people in charge of the factory, except for the head accountant, were women in 58 or so. So there's just these recurring things that I run across again and again, both of showing sort of empowerment, but also you have to think about, what were they going through? These are from Stania Gazeta, so sort of newspapers that were put up on the side of factories to educate workers. And one of the ones I have here, if you look on the right, you have this sort of, it's sort of a workplace PSA, like, please stop swearing while you're working, right? And you can see the woman there is not very happy with her male counterparts' vocabulary, you could say. So it's to me, it's just very suggestive of the types of things they were facing simultaneously that aren't being talked about. We call it like reading against the grain in historical studies. So I just ask you guys to look at these and think about that, right? The sort of chemicals that were involved in the process were really bad. Like both Ostromyslinsky and Lebedev, they died very, very young. Ostromyslinsky, after he went to America in 21, he died in 1928. Lebedev, made these factories in 1931, 32. He died in 1935. You have to think of the kind of chemicals that are going on. Like on the image on the right there, you see these chemical vents that are going on. They're trying to clean the air. There were scientific journals, industrial engineering devoted to trying to get cleaner air within factories, even by the 70s. If you go to the actual factories too, you can smell it. It's that kind of really stinky rubber that's just chemical and destructive. On the other side of this, there's also agriculture. In a lot of these images, I'm not selecting them. I was just looking for kolkhozes where they were cultivating the dandelion in the 50s. It's almost all exclusively women cultivating this stuff. It's all there. They're moving through this. They're even getting political lessons, right? Which evokes the question of the triple burden, right? You have the normal double burden of a woman doing their own work, being responsible for their own gendered labor. But in the Soviet Union, it's discussed that they also had to understand it as Marxist, right? So here's political lessons, understanding why the dandelions you're growing is good for Marxism. Just right there, plain and simple. And this leads me to the other question, which is this question of imperialism, the relationship between Central Asia and Russia throughout history. This dandelion was taken from the Almaty area and grown in Belarus, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, all the way up to Tyumen, actually, in Siberia. And there's just a story that I was hoping to save time to share, because we only find traces of this. The story goes like this. In the Kazan area, a Kazan committee was meeting to try and meet the demands of Khrushchev's corn crusade, right? We know the story of opening the virgin lands and growing corn, but one of the young committee members isn't very happy. He says, why are we growing corn on the steppe? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. He's chastened very quickly by an old wizened committee member who says, nothing they say survived the dandelions will survive with the corn. So to me, that story really evokes this larger, a prelude to the massive Soviet plantation system. You have corn, you have cotton, there's all these stories of it, and you think about what growing dandelions means, and there's a lot of scars. You can go, for example, this entire process, dandelion rubber is being grown today. These tires are being premiered at like the Tour de France last year. It's being grown in Germany now. But when you take stories about this dandelion rubber and you go to Russian news sources, it's met with a tirade of like anger. There's people who call it communist pseudoscience, right? Because they remember what happened in Kazan. It's not the strongest thing, but it really evokes the sort of scars that were wrought on the society. And so that's my only evidence right now. I still have to go do a lot more research, but that's sort of my general sense, is we can see that sort of impression of exploitation, even when it's not directly in the sources. So that's all I've got. I'm really curious to see what you all think about anything of that, and it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. One thing I can't get used to in Zoom is the failure to hear applause, but we are all applauding, I'm sure.
I can applaud myself.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Well, again, we'll save questions for the end, but jot down questions you have for Alex. I think that's really interesting research. Next up, we'll move along to Nicolas Chasse from McGill, who's an MA student at McGill. And he's going to present today on Soviet-American relations and the Vietnam War from 1964 to 73. So we'll pass it over to Nicholas.
Thank you, Professor Fraser, for that introduction. I'll just set up my screen very rapidly. All right, so hello everyone, my name is Nicolas Chasse. I'm a master's student at McGill. So my research interest just rapidly focuses on the history of international relations during the Cold War, with a specific emphasis on diplomatic history. So, I just want to say really quick, thank you for inviting me to talk here today at the EURUS conference. I truly feel honored to be here, and it's a great privilege. So today I'll be talking about my paper, which is entitled Soviet-American Relations and the Vietnam War, 1964-73. But before I do that, I think it's important to contextualize the importance of the Vietnam War within the broader context of the Cold War. So the Vietnam War is actually the second post-World War II conflict which occurs within the region. The first was the French Indochina War from 1946 to 54, the result of which granted independence to Vietnam under the Geneva Conference and a temporary division of the country at the 17th parallel. So with the promise of unifications under fair elections in 1956, both superpowers of the Cold War, the West and the Communist bloc, supported either side. So the South's support came from the United States, and the North from the Communist bloc under the Sino-Soviet alliance. So with the American backing of the Diem coup in South Vietnam in 1956, these elections never happened, and both sides were now divided by their ideology. So the Second Vietnam War initially was a civil war between Northern communists in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, here referred as the DRV, and Southern nationalists, which were backed by the United States. So beginning in 1964, North Vietnam pushed for military confrontation in the South in a gamble to force South foreign interference and unify Vietnam under communist rule. The resulting Tonkin Gulf incident in August of that year brings in American military troops into the fold, which transformed the Civil War into much more global scale. So the Soviet Union becomes interested in the region around the same time, and up until Brezhnev, the former socialist state was uninterested in Vietnam as a territory of value, and instead, through their Sino-Soviet alliance, they let the People's Republic of China, or PCR, act as the main supplier and diplomatic liaison to the DRV. And this happens under Stalin and Khrushchev, and because Vietnam was such a faraway nation, with war in its past, it did not see any interest in representing the territory. It seemed like a waste of resources, especially given that the USSR spent much of the 1950s fostering communism over Eastern Europe. So the Sino-Soviet split evidently changes this policy dogma, as the Soviet Union was now actively trying to undermine the PCR. So as both communist nations came to ideological disagreements, which marked the end of the alliance, the USSR became concerned that China would try and overtake the mantle of the communist world, meaning that it would become the representative figure leading emerging nations towards communism. So consequently, the Soviets changed their own outlook on the third world, including Vietnam, to undermine the PCR and preserve their mantle of the communist world. So the split, which was coupled by the removal of Khrushchev in '64 and Brezhnev's appointment to Secretary General, changed the Soviet foreign policy to North Vietnam, as it actually began supplying the DRV. Now, unfortunately, their commitment to the DRV came in direct contrast to the peaceful coexistence policy of the Soviet Union, meaning it consisted of agreement between socialist states to establish better relations with the West, despite the ideological disagreements. So consequently, with both superpowers backing opposite sides of the Vietnam War, the civil war between communists and nationalists rapidly becomes a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So my research question for this topic was trying to understand how the involvement of Soviet involvement in Vietnam, which begins around 1964, affects the dynamic of Soviet-American relations within the broader context of the Cold War diplomacy. So making use of newly available Foreign Relations of the United States archives, or FRUS, and translated memoirs from Soviet officials, I suggested the Vietnam War essentially delays a period of détente between both countries, as the proxy war becomes a central cause of diplomatic tensions. So, for the remainder of my presentations, I'd like to focus on a subset of questions which interest me at the moment, and that can kind of explain what I'm doing in my research. So, firstly, why is the Vietnam War so important for both countries? How does Vietnam affect Soviet-American relations? And how are Soviet Americans trying to improve the diplomatic situation? So firstly, why is Vietnam so important for both countries? So the Vietnam War stands out from other proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, because unlike the Middle East and to an extent even Cuba, there's a strong component of ideology which motivates both sides. So for the Soviet Union, it is this defense of the international proletariat, and North Vietnam, which plays an important role, as they were supporting a fellow socialist country against American interference. And within the ideological clash that is the Cold War, the rhetoric of anti-imperialism played an important role in the formation of Soviet foreign policy. And the Soviets were trying to demonstrate on the international scene that communism was in fact the right ideology for emerging nations which had recently obtained their independence. And for the United States, their fear of communist expansion in East Asia motivated their support of South Vietnam. So, following the defeat of nationalists in the Chinese Civil War, American policymakers feared further expansion of the communist ideology among emerging nations of East Asia. The domino theory came to be from that fear, which was coined by former American President Dwight D. Eisenhower in '54. And this theory proclaimed that if one country was to fall under communist rule, then the rest would essentially follow suit. The United States also being willing to preserve its international image is a motivating factor. The related sink cost of the resources it had already invested in South Vietnam, which was also coupled by the ideology of American superiority against communism and the Soviets. So this meant that an American military defeat in Vietnam will be catastrophic to its international image. Not only would it make capitalism seem less viable as an ideology for emerging nations, It would also show that America could be defeated in a military conflict, something that had never before happened. So secondly, how does the Vietnam War affect Soviet-American relations? So as we've seen, with both sides clinging to Vietnam due to its ideological importance, it becomes evident very early on that the proxy war's developments affects their relations. Now, the first sign of which occurs in February 1965, when Anthony Dobrynin, then Soviet ambassador to Washington, warned that the Soviet Union would help defend North Vietnam against American actions. And he also commented on Johnson's airstrikes campaign in North Vietnam, stating that American actions within the region were contradictory to their willingness to establish better relations with the Soviet states. So Dobrynin was in fact referring to the concept of peaceful coexistence between both countries. So I've previously discussed as being this agreement between socialist states to establish better relations with the West, despite the ideological disagreements. And this policy marked a stark contrast from Stalin's antagonistic approach to the West during the 50s. And the doctrine actually began gaining traction on the diplomatic scene following the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62. Both countries came to the verge of nuclear war. So with the Soviet leadership adopting a more pragmatic outlook to the West, the possibility of peaceful coexistence actually becomes much more accessible, as both nations were now attempting to distance themselves from the escalations that had previously defined their relations. They began diplomatic talks on multiple exchanges, specifically regarding the European developments, limitations on the usage of nuclear weapons, and even the possibility of a summit. However, with the implication of both countries in Vietnam, this reality soon changes. There's increased disagreements on diplomatic talks, and it endangers the possibility of a peaceful coexistence. And internally, however, the recognition of this issue actually occurs very early on. The Soviet leadership stated within its own party that Vietnam and the United States were the central issues to its foreign policy. However, it also unanimously recognized that progress with the United States relations was a priority over the Vietnam War, since it was more vital to their own interests. However, with the strong factor of ideology being this international solidarity with the socialist state of Vietnam, it was deeply integrated within the thoughts of Soviet leaders and thus kept hindering relations with the United States. As Dobrynin, the former Soviet ambassador, recognized that this issue was in fact sometimes detrimental to their own interests. So Soviet leaders coined this internally as this Vietnam syndrome, and even including Brezhnev, and it actually remained a heavy burden for Soviet foreign policy for the years to come. And evidently, the United States also had their own Soviet syndrome, which was actually much more prevalent in the Soviets. So specifically regarding Johnson's goal of being perceived as a Cold Warrior, meant that backing down from the Vietnam War would hinder his political image and threaten the passage of domestic legislature, specifically referring to his Great Society project. And the ideological importance of Vietnam also influenced the decision-making process of the Americans, and thus hindered their own outlook on developing relations with the Soviets. And this is noticeable with Johnson's discussions and developments in Europe and the Soviet Union, as he proclaimed that if the Vietnam War was to continue, it would be difficult to expect any developments to be made in European affairs. So finally, how are Soviet Americans trying to improve the diplomatic situations? So although the Vietnam War had a heavy impact on the development, diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and the United States, it did not mean that relations escalated between both nations during the first 4 years of this era. So I'll be looking at during Johnson's presidency. So on the contrary, the 4-year period actually represented a stagnant on the state of Soviet-American relations, with the slow opening of both countries, despite Vietnam's competition. So most notably, the American administration under Johnson was inherently much more open than its predecessor in the Soviet Union under John F. Kennedy. So although publicly Johnson preserved his attitude of the Cold Warrior, in private he actually wanted to achieve diplomatic progress with the Soviets. And Johnson expressed this interest to establishing better agreements with the Soviet Union on other issues, and specifically regarding cultural changes and outer space. And he specifically entices these developments with the Soviet Union to promote a better relationship with them despite the ongoing war. So unfortunately, while the Kremlin did appreciate, Johnson's effort at establishing better relations with the Soviet Union despite its Vietnam policies, the ideological principle of international proletariat in Hanoi, in support of Hanoi, still struck hard within the Soviets, and they could not fully accept Johnson's approach at normalizing relations while disregarding what was happening in Vietnam. And the Soviet Union, in fact, took a very different approach to Vietnam and the United States. And they actually sought to force the United States to settle for peace in Vietnam very early on by using Britain's government as a facilitator in the process. And Moscow's stance on the American role in Vietnam stipulated that further American involvement in Vietnam would force the USSR to escalate its assistance to the DRV. And the only way by which they saw the end of the war was for the Americans to recognize Vietnam's legitimacy and withdraw their forces. And in turn, the end of the conflict, which would have a positive effect on Soviet-American relations, and could actually open the possibility to solve other international issues. So, nevertheless, the United States and the Soviet Union did in fact reach an tentative arguments and agreements on some issues during this period of really intense ideological tensions. And most notably, they actually coordinated the response to the Six-Day War in 1967, despite supporting opposite sides of the conflict. So the result being the Resolution 242, which actually would be acceptable to both Arab states and Israel. So I think this diplomatic progress marks the willingness of both countries to move past certain issues, and in turn highlights the importance of Vietnam as being so ideologically important that they were unable to do so. So with the ideological importance, finally, Vietnam still looms over the formation of the foreign policy of both superpowers, and major developments on the relations of Soviet Americans would not occur until after Johnson's presidency in 1969. That year actually representing a turning point for both superpowers, and it changed their outlook on the Vietnam War and the relationship with their Cold War counterpart. On the one hand, Nixon's presidency, which sought this quest for honorable peace and withdraw the American forces, and on the other hand, the Soviet Union's more favorable outlook on the Third World, meant that actually both countries were not able to move on from this war. So I'm happy to address any questions regarding my methods, sources, or any of my arguments beyond 1968. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Nicholas. Everyone, I'll applaud on behalf of everyone. There was a few emoji applause things going on. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. Quick reminder, everyone, double check your muting while our presenters are delivering their talks, if you don't mind, to make sure we can all hear them. Next, we have Cory Osmond, who is an MA student at the University of Toronto, and he'll be presenting on Foreshadowing the Collapse of Communism in Eastern Europe, the 1980 to 81 Polish crisis, and the Brezhnev Doctrine. Take it away, Cory.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here and having the opportunity to speak. So what I'm going to do is give you a historical look at the Brezhnev Doctrine, the origins of where it comes from, where it started, and sort of the impact that it had when it first appeared in Czechoslovakia, and then compare it to what that looked like in Poland. And the aim is to shift sort of this narrative that it was Gorbachev that allowed Eastern Europe to sort of take its own path. So it's a sort of a shift in the narrative of what if this type of thinking had occurred earlier on, which I argue the thinking started with Brezhnev, and there was a complete shift in Soviet thought that is what allowed Mikhail Gorbachev to undertake his reforms, and it is what gave us sort of the collapse of communism. So the notion that this moment in time, all the ingredients were there for communism to sort of collapse. And it took a little while for that to occur, but that in this moment in time, in this Polish crisis, they were all there. So this is just there's a lot of moving parts, and this is just sort of a snapshot into it. So I'm happy to engage with questions later, because so much has had to be cut out and condensed. But hopefully this will give a good overview of the impact of the Brezhnev Doctrine. So as the 1970s came to a close, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, signaled an end to détente with the West. The Soviet Union aimed to expand their sphere of influence in the Middle East by invading Afghanistan in December 1979. With no end of the Cold War in sight, the Soviet Union appeared to be at the height of its power heading into the new decade. Unforeseen to anyone was that the 1980s would mark an end to the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe. While the Soviet Union may have seemed as powerful as ever, underneath the surface was a decaying empire. Nearly a decade past its prime, the Soviet Union was ideologically, economically, and politically backwards. Although there is no one reason that can explain the collapse of communism or where it began, the 1980 Polish crisis and the events surrounding it is our first glimpse into when the cracks in the Iron Curtain began to appear. Cracks that, when picked at long enough, would eventually cause the Soviet system to collapse in on itself. So at first glance, the Polish crisis may not seem as if it is a significant event. The Polish crisis did not simply appear overnight, but stems from the fact that communism was superimposed on all the states of Eastern Europe. For this reason, resistance and rebellion became a common fixture throughout the Eastern Bloc. One needs to look no further than the uprisings in East Germany in 1953, Hungary and Poland in 1956, and Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Prague Spring represents an interesting comparison to the Polish crisis, as it shows how drastically Soviet foreign policy changed in just over a decade. For context, in 1968, Czechoslovakia was undergoing a period of liberalization under newly appointed leader Alexander Dubček. Socialism with a human face aimed to revitalize the socialist project in the country by allowing freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, increased access to consumer goods, a rolling back of the power of the secret police, and also opened the door to improving relations with the West, and the possibility of multi-party, albeit socially led governments. Back in Moscow, the situation began to feel all too familiar. In 1956, Hungary had undertaken a similar, short-lived period of liberalization that ended with Soviet tanks crushing what became a breakaway state. However, that rebellion was put down by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. In this case, the Prague Spring represented the first major challenge to Soviet power under Brezhnev's leadership. Having come to power in 1964, Brezhnev was determined to chart his own course and handle domestic turmoil differently than his predecessor. It is important to consider that the Soviet Union believed all of Eastern Europe was its domestic sphere. Therefore, no dissent or infidelity to Marxist-Leninist teachings would be tolerated. As a result, on August 20th, 1968, the Brezhnev Doctrine was born, as the Warsaw Pact occupied Czechoslovakia. To sum up what the Brezhnev Doctrine meant, Brezhnev told Alexander Dubček, quote, "Your country lies on territory where the Soviet soldier trod in the Second World War. We bought that territory at the cost of enormous sacrifice, and we shall never leave it. The borders of that area are our borders as well." So although the Soviet Union may have been losing the hearts and minds of Eastern Europe, Brezhnev had struck fear into the soul of the Soviet Empire. So what exactly made the 1980 Polish crisis different than any other rebellion in the Soviet Union's history? And why was the Brezhnev Doctrine invoked in 1968 but not 1980? Well, to simplify matters, the 1970s was economically devastating for the Soviet Union and countries of the Eastern Bloc. Stagflation spread throughout the social states as economies stagnated and inflation soared. Poland was hit especially hard by the economic downturn and global recession, as they had borrowed heavily from Western countries in order to achieve a great leap forward, which never came, as Soviet-style economics resulted in inefficiency that the Polish government could not simply remedy with foreign loans. When the global markets took a turn in the late 1970s, Poland's economy shrank. As a result, by 1981, in the thick of the Polish crisis, Poland's debt was over $27 billion, with the majority of debt owed to American banks. But the 1970s had initially appeared to favor the Soviet economy. As the price of oil soared, petrodollars fueled the state. As a result, the Soviet Union was able to provide heavily subsidized oil exports to the Eastern Bloc, which buoyed their economies. Winning the hearts and minds, or in this case, pacifying non-communist believers, came at a steep price. Poland had become dependent on the Soviet Union's oil, and once the Soviet Union stopped heavily subsidizing oil exports, the Polish economy began to suffer, and therefore required more aid from the Soviet Union. While this may have been possible, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan led to the United States placing heavy sanctions on the Soviet Union in 1980, which temporarily closed off loans from the Western markets to the Warsaw Pact states. Therefore, in 1980, the Soviet Union became economically tied to the survival of the bloc. The Soviet economic crisis of the 1970s would have knock-on effects that played a key role in sparking the Polish crisis. As what caused the Polish crisis is what caused nearly every communist rebellion, a need to reform a failing system. The reason why the economic situation was so dire in Poland was because the state had severely mismanaged the country's resources. As a result, the state lacked coal, building supplies, and the technical machinery that was necessary to drag Poland out of a spiraling depression. Corruption was also widespread as the Polish elite plundered the state. In an attempt to paper over the widening cracks in society, workers were exploited by lowering wages and increasing working hours in order to boost production. As it stood, a great majority of Poles felt no connection to the social state and had no interest in seeing out the success of the communist project. Because of this disconnect between the people and the state, a thriving underground network of anti-communists developed, which was headed by the Workers' Defense Committee. While the Polish People's Party, the PZPR, was able to suppress the underground throughout the late 70s, by the summer of 1980, tensions finally boiled over and mass worker strikes broke out at the Lenin shipyards in Dansk. Throughout August, strikes spread across the country, and in an attempt to try to quell the strikes, PZPR leader Edward Gierek granted official trade union status to Solidarity on August 31st. Solidarity's popularity and support skyrocketed, as this was the first time that an opposition party had been legalized within the Eastern Bloc. It is worth noting that in 1980, Solidarity did not want to topple communism, but instead wanted to fulfill the promise of the socialist dream. So what was the Soviet response? Of course, the first thing to do was force Polish First Secretary Edward Gierek to resign. In the Politburo's eyes, the agreement with Solidarity was as good as treason. On September 6th, he was replaced by Stanislav Kania, who would go on to last a pathetic 13 months on the job. The second item on the agenda was to establish a commission, chaired by Second Secretary of the Politburo, Mikhail Suslov. The commission consisted of Foreign Minister Andrei Groyko, Secretary of Defense Dmitry Ustinov, and Chairman of the KGB and successor to Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov. 3 days later, the commission reconvened and, to their dismay, discovered that the situation was worse than expected. Not only had worker strikes swept across the country, but they were informed that structurally, socialism in Poland was dying. The Catholic religion was more popular than ever, in large part thanks to the papacy of Polish Pope John Paul II, which represented a unique challenge to Poland, as Poland was the only country where the Soviets were unable to dislodge religious traditions. On top of that, the Communist Youth League was non-existent. There was no future generation of loyal communist supporters. With this being the case, the Commission unanimously supported a non-interventionist approach, as they feared that, unlike in 1968, if the Warsaw Pact intervened, it would lead to a domino of breakaway states in support of Solidarity. There was also the naive hope that Secretary Kania would put a swift end to the strikes by enforcing martial law. However, by December, Brezhnev was growing tired of Kania's inability to put an end to the crisis. For months, the Soviet Union had continued to divert precious resources from the bloc in order to prop up Poland's economy, only to have it squandered by never-ending strikes. Fed up with supply shortages and out of the fear of the crisis spilling over to Poland's neighbors, the Warsaw Pact leaders convened on December 5th and decided it was time for a show of force. They agreed that the crisis was strictly a Polish issue and therefore required a Polish solution. However, to speed up the process, they decided to hold the Warsaw Pact's annual war games from December 8th to the 21st to show Polish leadership what would happen if the crisis was not handled swiftly. Although the Warsaw Pact favored non-intervention, behind closed doors, Soviet officials were planning for an invasion. On December 1st in Moscow, Soviet Chief of Staff Marshal Nikolai Orgakov met with Polish Deputy Chief of Staff General Tudish to discuss how the invasion would occur. During the war games, over 100,000 Soviet, East German, and Czech troops would enter Poland and occupy all major industrial centers, causing Solidarity to stand down. On December 3rd, Marshal Orgakov informed the Czech General Staff that the invasion was ready to go at any time. All they were waiting for was Brezhnev's approval. At this point, an invasion also appeared inevitable to the CIA. Although there was little that President Jimmy Carter could do to halt an invasion, on December 3rd, he sent Brezhnev a message via the Cold War hotline, outlining that they knew of the Warsaw Pact's plans to invade Poland. Carter also made clear that the US had no intention to use the crisis as a way to gain a foothold in Eastern Europe. However, in any case, an invasion of Poland would, quote, have most negative consequences for East-West relations in general, and US-Soviet relations in particular. In response, Brezhnev replied to Carter simply with, quote, "best wishes." However, days later, on December 11th, Brezhnev put any possible invasion on hold indefinitely. Instead, he put his faith in Kenya to end the crisis. So the main question is, and the most puzzling one, is with the Warsaw Pact troops stationed on Poland's borders and ready to bring an end to the drawn-out crisis, why did Brezhnev call it off? The short answer is that it all came down to economics. The Soviet decision to invade Afghanistan begins to loom large as Western sanctions were crippling the Soviet economy. Following Brezhnev's response of best wishes, Carter began making calls to fellow Western leaders with the purpose of drawing up the harshest possible sanctions in the event of the Warsaw Pact invasion. On December 9th, Brezhnev was informed of these sanctions and 2 days later called off the invasion. The option of military intervention was never discussed again. While the Brezhnev Doctrine was now dead, Soviet thinking continued to shift. After all, what is the point of an empire and satellite states if they're constantly hurting the homeland? 1981 would prove to be a decisive turning point in the Soviet leadership's thinking. Poland's enormous debt was beginning to have disastrous effects as they required a $10 billion loan to keep their economy going. To make matters worse, Poland also immediately required $1.5 billion to service their debt to American banks, which could only be paid through increased selling of Soviet oil. To this point, Bulgarian leader Todor Zhivkov chastised Stanislav Kania, stating, quote, "You cannot live endlessly on credit and demand a better life without improving relations." However, Poland had not only become dependent on Soviet assistance, they expected it. Unwilling to improve the crisis or the economy, Kania believed that Brezhnev would support them until the end. In March 26th, meeting with Brezhnev, ministers Arkhipov and Groymko stressed that it was time to start redirecting resources to the Soviet Union's struggling economy, instead of worrying about Poland, which to them was already a failed state. The diversion of resources to Poland had caused the entire Eastern Bloc to slip into a recession. As a result, the USSR was becoming economically responsible for the whole region. Fast forward to August 1981, several Warsaw Pact leaders visited Brezhnev in Crimea, urging for military intervention. In one conversation with East German leader Erich Honecker, Brezhnev stated, quote, "Depending on the future course of events with Poland will be socialist. Will relations be internationalist? Will it move along a different path? Will the nature of relations become something different along state, political, and economic lines? What precisely is done in the near future must, of course, be decided by Polish leadership itself." So what we can see from this quote is that Brezhnev's thinking began to sound a lot more like Gorbachev's future Sinatra Doctrine than it did the Brezhnev Doctrine. He too was prepared to let Poland take its own path if it meant lessening the burden on the Soviet Union. Although Polish leadership would eventually bring an end to the crisis by placing the country under martial law on December 13th, the damage that the crisis inflicted on the future of the bloc could never be undone. The crisis foreshadowed the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, as not only was Brezhnev's thinking changed, but so too was Brezhnev's successor, Yuri Andropov. As he stated, quote, "We must be concerned above all with our own country and about the strengthening of the Soviet Union. Therein lies the thinking and direction that the Soviet Union would take throughout the rest of the 1980s. The Polish crisis forced the USSR to make tough decisions. In the end, they were forced to look inward and refocus their efforts to save communism within the Soviet Union. In the end, Soviet power would never be the same. The Brezhnev Doctrine gave way to the Sinatra Doctrine, and under Gorbachev, the Eastern Bloc was officially permitted to take its own path towards socialism. As a result, in 1989, Solidarity defeated the Polish People's Party in the first openly held democratic elections in the Eastern Bloc, ushering in a wave of democracy and the collapse of communism that would have never been possible without the death of the Brezhnev Doctrine. So I appreciate you listening, and this is just one piece of what has to be probably thousands of theories and ideas on why communism failed and why the Soviet Union collapsed. So I'm interested in hearing some of your thoughts and some questions you have on what is just one small piece of a very complicated collapse of communism. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Cory. Yes, much to discuss still. I hope folks are jotting down questions as our presenters move through their material. Lots to talk about here. Okay, you're all keeping to time quite well, so I appreciate that. Anna, it's on you to keep to time as well. No, our last final presenter, I guess, of the conference, as well as our panel, is Anna Kozlova, who is a PhD candidate here at Carleton. and she'll be presenting on Neither Here Nor There, National Identity and Belonging Amongst Russian-German Migrants. Go ahead, Anna.
Thank you very much, Erica, for the introduction. And thank you to all the other presenters for their wonderful presentations, and for everyone for still being here, because I know this is the last presentation of the conference. So today I will be talking about the research that I conducted as part of my master's thesis in Germany. So I'll talk a bit about my current research for my PhD at the end as well. So I'll start off with the project background, then go into my research questions, methodology, present my findings, and my current research, which I'm doing for my PhD right now. So in keeping with the conference's theme of the evolving relationship between Europe and Russia, I thought that I would take a step back and give a bit of a history preamble before delving into my own research. Throughout its history, the West had a difficult time in defining Russia, as it didn't quite fit the mold. When Russia adopted Orthodox Christianity as its official religion at the end of the 10th century, this set it apart from Western Europe. Then, during the Tatar-Mongol invasion of the 12th century, Russia became very isolated from the rest of Europe until the 15th century, which led to Europe perceiving it as the barbaric other. Russia's development stagnated, and it wasn't until Tsar Peter the Great modernization campaign that Russia began to be seen as an equal by other European powers. Inspired by Peter the Great, Prussian-born Empress Catherine the Great continued Russia's efforts to enter the Enlightenment and declared Russia a European state. Now, coming back to my own topic, during her reign, one of Catherine's efforts was to bring Russia and Europe closer together. And she did this through an immigration campaign which was aimed at Germany. Catherine promised all who migrated to Russia free land, guaranteed protection against mandatory military service, and the right to preserve their language, culture, and religion. This particularly appealed to Mennonite Germans who were pacifists, and the majority of those who migrated to Russia settled along the Volga River. So as you can see here on this map, this is German immigration to Russia from the 18th and 19th century. So the bubbles are the places where the people were coming from, and the red is the places where they were settling in. And this is the Volga River, and the majority of them settled in here in this region next to Saratov. So fast forward some years later, following the Russian Revolution, the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic was established in 1918. Germans constitute 2/3 of the population. The capital was Engels, which was formerly known as Pokrovsk. The Republic had German language schools, newspapers, churches. However, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 during World War II, everything changed and the Republic was abolished. So suddenly all individuals of German descent were considered enemies of the state by Stalin and were deported to Siberia and Central Asia. Men were separated from their families and sent to labor camps. Approximately 222,000 Volga Germans were forced to work in the labor army camps. And all traces of German culture were removed during this time, with German speakers being heavily persecuted. In 1953, Germany passed the Federal Expellee and Refugee Law, the goal of which was to provide a homeland for ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union who had experienced forced resettlement, ethnic discrimination, and expulsion during and after World War II. Starting from the late 1970s, individuals with Russian-German descent started to migrate to Germany and claim German citizenship. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loosening of immigration restrictions, more individuals migrated to Germany, with 400,000 individuals of Russian-German background coming to Germany between 1989 and 1990. Presently, the Russian-German minority is the second largest minority group behind the Turkish minority in Germany, constituting approximately 3 million individuals. However, by the time the majority of these individuals came to Germany, for many of them, their last name was the only connection that they had to Germany. So now for my master's thesis project. The research questions that I focused on during my master's thesis were: what factors influence individuals' perception of their national identity? And specifically, what role do language and shared customs play in the formation of individuals' sense of belonging to a certain place and culture? So my methodology consisted of gathering qualitative data in the form of semi-structured in-depth interviews with first-generation descendants of Russian Germans who were not born in Germany, but migrated there prior to the age of 18 and had the chance to attend some school in Germany. The reason that I wanted to interview individuals who migrated prior to turning 18 and who attended school in Germany was because their sense of national identity was more malleable, and school is an important socializing agent. I conducted the interviews in Russian, which I then translated into English. Afterwards, I conducted content analysis of the interviews through an open coding technique where I coded interviews based on the themes that emerged from the interview transcripts. Language was a recurring theme in the narratives of the interviewees. All of the interviewees mentioned that the thing that connected them to Russian culture was the language. However, since the interviews migrated to Germany at various ages, some interviewees began to experience language attrition and forget their mother tongue, which was Russian. All of the interviewees had very little knowledge of German prior to migrating to Germany, but all of them were able to quickly master it. However, the same wasn't true for their parents. And many of the interviewees reported that their parents still didn't feel quite comfortable in speaking in German and still mostly associated in Russian-speaking circles. This is a quote from one of the interviewees, and he talked about how even though he was able to learn German quickly and was able to socialize in that environment, he still preferred to remain in the Russian-speaking groups and that he still felt more at home in Russian-speaking countries. The question of national identity was the main thing that I wanted to explore in my master's thesis because I could imagine that it would be a complicated issue for these migrants. National identity meant different things to different people. For some interviewees, national identity was defined by their citizenship. For others, it was about their mother tongue. Although some interviewees reported feeling German, for the majority of them, they reported feeling a multitude of identities. However, what they struggled with the most is not how they identified themselves, but how others identified them. And the common trend that was reported by the interviewees is the feeling of otherness that they felt both growing up in the Soviet Union and upon moving to Germany. So the sense of otherness, othering is a process which involves the construction of the self or the in-group and the other or out-group. So this is a quote from an interviewee who was talking about the sense of otherness that he experienced as someone of a Russian-German background. He said, "You're neither this nor that. So in other words, you don't belong here nor there. And that's why I feel neither German nor Russian. I understand that even though I didn't grow up in Russia, I still feel closer to the Russian-speaking regions, but I don't tie myself completely to anything." This is also what another interviewee mentioned in his experience. He said, "When I was still living in Latvia, they called me German. And when I came here to Germany, at first, of course, I was considered a Russian. Upon coming to Germany, many of the interviewees thought that they were returning to an ancestral homeland, but were surprised when they got to Germany and were not seen as Germans, but instead as Russians." This connects to the notion of the significant other, which is a concept introduced by Anna Triandafilidou, that she defined as another nation or ethnic group that threatens, or rather is perceived to threaten, its ethnic or cultural purity and its independence. So this serves as a distinction between those who belong to the nation and those who do not. Another interesting finding that emerged is that the othering process was not only something that happened to the interviewees, but something that they engaged in themselves. As this quote from one of the interviewees demonstrates, his family always liked to think of themselves as German and somehow different from the other people living in Kazakhstan, where they were from. So he talks about it here, and he says, "My family has always been proud that they're German. When they were deported to Siberia under the Stalin regime, this idea that they are German helped them survive and made them stronger. And my parents are proud that they are German. For example, my family would explain to me that Germans are hardworking, and that's why they're successful, and that's how they differ from Russians and Kazakhs." So my current PhD research is focused on transnational Russian-German migrants in Manitoba, Canada. I'm going to be looking at multiple country migration from the former USSR to Germany and then to Canada. I plan on conducting qualitative interviews in Steinbach and Winkler, Manitoba, which are small towns with predominantly Russian-German population. The reason for choosing Manitoba for my next project is because German is the second most widely spoken language in Manitoba, and 22% of the population is of German origin. There are German language newspapers, and apparently you can find jobs where you only need to speak German and you don't even need to know English. Manitoba has a history of German settlement, starting with early Mennonite settlements. However, there's been a lot of Russian-German migration that is taking place there now, which is very recent, from the 2000s onwards. And that's primarily what I'm interested in, because the individuals that are migrating to Manitoba, they're not coming directly from the former Soviet Union. They have settled first in Germany, lived there for some years, some lived there for 20 years, and are now migrating to Manitoba. A lot of the individuals have Mennonite roots and have begun to establish a lot of churches in towns that they're migrating, creating a sense of community and reestablishing a symbolic Volga German Republic of sorts. So the research questions that I'm looking at in my current research are: how is the meaning of homeland and feeling at home interpreted by these individuals, and how do they use their transnational links to build communities in their countries of settlement? I'm very interested in terms of why these individuals have come to Manitoba after having settled in Germany, and why a lot of it seems to be very driven around the same communities. So a lot of the settlements is happening in the same towns. Hopefully the pandemic will not get in the way of this research anymore, and I'll be able to conduct my field work later on this year, but we'll see what happens. Thank you very much for your time.
There, unmute myself. How many of us have done that in the past 2 days? Start talking and still have the mute button on. Thank you, Anna. That's I've heard a bit about your research before, and it's always really, really interesting. I see some questions already coming into the chat. I'm just going to talk for a very brief amount of time because I want us to make sure that we do have time for questions from other folks. Thank you to all our panelists. I think these are really interesting projects that you're working on, and a sort of diverse group of papers for this panel, as it's up to me to bring them all together, which I can tell you right now I will not be able to do, but I think that's okay also. So I'll give a few thoughts and a few questions to each of you. For those in the audience, feel free to put a few questions into the chat, and I can sort of read those out once I've given a few remarks here and give the floor back to the panelists. So we have quite a variety on this panel: environmental and commodity history from Alex, 2 new takes on diplomatic history, Anna's migration and identity history. I think are really sort of great ways for us to wrap up the conference and to think about the panel topic of Imperial Legacies and Soviet histories. I think in all 4, we get this sense of the Soviet government versus various population groups, this sense of a government, a state apparatus of some sort, maybe an individual leader like Brezhnev trying to control or dictate or create circumstances with a variety of populations. The Kazakhs, I have a question about coming up, Alex, but the Vietnam War, people of Poland, and the Volga Germans. We also get sort of a sense of the ways in which we might think about imperial legacies or Soviet legacies. Cory's big question about a slice of the collapse of communism. There's so many different directions that can go in, but you know, something that I think many of us are continuing to research and try to provide new perspectives on. I'll have a few questions for each of you. You can maybe just sort of sit on, and if we get to them as you're talking with other questions later, so be it, and if not, that's okay too. Alex, quickly before the real question on the women workers, this is really, really interesting, and I hope you do pursue that in your bigger dissertation project. I understand you were talking about before the World War II in the 50s, but those particular examples of women workers in the 50s, there's no men, of course, right? When we have the group photographs of women on the kolkhoz and in political meetings, it's because women were running everything because of the war deaths. So I think you probably know that, but I didn't see quite a mention of that context of why there's so many women in photographs and just everywhere in the workforce in 1952, 58, a couple of your photos. But overall, I wonder how you see the relationship between Moscow and Kazakhstan playing out here. I think the project is really, really interesting, and how does the Soviet Union get rubber, I think is just I'm really looking forward to reading the project when it's done. But whither the Kazakhs, right? What do local leaders think of this? How are you, sort of shining a light on that? Is it a project from Moscow, and or in what ways does the local matter here? Does the sort of imperial context, the colonized within the Soviet Union, depending how you characterize it, how does that matter for rubber? I think it's really interesting research you're doing, though. Nicholas, I really enjoyed your sort of retake on the negotiations about the Vietnam War. In the written text I got from you, I'm not sure if you mentioned this when you were speaking, but the written version I saw earlier mentioned newly available archives you're looking at from the Foreign Office of the US and Soviet diplomatic memoirs. And I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about your sources in terms of what was new in these new archives you were looking at. And I'm someone who works a lot with memoirs myself, so I'm always interested in hearing about how people theorize memoirs and what you read about them. Like, I wonder if the Soviet diplomats in their memoirs are trying to make themselves look more peace-loving, and we were just trying to find a peaceful solution, a new date, and an early détente, if not for this war. I wonder if part of it is the factor of memory in the diplomats' texts playing out there, and how you're thinking about that. Cory, I guess similar to the Kazakh question, what do you see the role of the Polish people here? Is this Brezhnev making a decision, the Soviet government sort of following their doctrine and adjusting it where they see fit, and sort of taking control of the situation, or where we fit Poland in here, and not just the Polish government, but the protesters on the streets, and not just even Lech Wałęsa, but the people in the streets? Is there a way to agency is sort of a passé word, I know, but to theorize or think about their role in the Soviet leadership having to change course in some way? Where do we fit the people in Poland in here? And Anna, I was going to ask you about your interviews, and I'm jotting down this great interview question, and then you went completely into the method that you're using in detail. So I won't make you tell us more about that. I think it sounds really interesting. I guess I'm wondering where Canada fits in, as opposed to maybe apart from, yes, we are here and you can do research in Manitoba, but as an identity formation, I guess, and especially how you might be thinking about other Manitoba identities, thinking in particular about Indigenous and Métis identities in Manitoba, along with the history of Mennonite settlers and other settler identities, for not just Canada-wide, but I know, having spent a lot of childhood time in Manitoba, it's a particular province and provincial identity that's very mixed, and has, of course, a real fraught settler history. And so I wonder where your population group fits in there. And just at the very end, when you said the attempt to sort of think of it as a new Volga German republic in Manitoba, that, like, what? Wait a second. I think that's really, really fascinating. So I wonder if you could say a few words about that. Well, that's, I think, about our time. So I will thank Alex, Nicholas, Cory, and Anna for great presentations today and a great panel. I'm just going to throw it back to Jeff to conclude the conference overall. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for an excellent last panel that just kept up the momentum of the entire conference. And as an organizer, I've got to say, this is when you feel the best about everything, because nothing except this talk can go wrong at this point. And we've had 5 excellent panels and really fantastic attendance. I think even if we were ACs, we'd be really happy with the numbers we got, and especially with Zoom fatigue. And I think it was due to the quality of the papers from the very beginning, those abstracts, got us really excited when we started to put this together. The way the panels came together really nicely. The work of our commentators chairs, so Paul, Erica, Joan, who am I forgetting? Myself, and especially to Leah Rasmussen, who did all the technical work. And it may not seem, when everything works smoothly, it's when you're not mentioned that it's when you've done a great job. And because we didn't have to worry about any of this stuff, this stuff doesn't happen without a lot of work behind the scenes. And Leah did a fantastic job. But also to all the presenters too, it's fantastic to really see so much exciting scholarship in process. And we really look forward to following your careers, whether you move through academia or whatever field you're in. And I hope you keep in touch with us at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Thanks again to Ken Ross Gould and to the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Series for their support. And I wish everyone an excellent weekend. And for those of you in Ontario, there's a few hours of beautiful warmth and sunshine left, and may as well take advantage of that, because who knows how long it's going to last. So thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And hopefully we'll have this again happening next year. Bye, everyone.